Put your earphones on. You're not seeing me yet, no? Okay. Okay, so you're seeing me, I'm in motion and everything. Okay? Now listen carefully. Hello? I'm talking in the microphone. Can you hear me? Okay, all good? You can hear me loud and clear through the earphones.
Yeah, you just said
Okay. Okay. So it's all working.
Yeah.
That's the bottom. Okay, never mind the delay. This is not a live sports event. Who cares about it?
No gambling.
Gambling, yeah, people gambling on whether you say that 1953 Coup was organized by the Shah or by the Americans.
But there is a delay on that, no?
Yeah, there is a delay because that's the YouTube
Professor Emeritus. I don't know if it's Emeritus Professor, I don't know.
It's a city university.
Oh, City, yeah.
Professor.
I know, I was just Professor of History. I'll just wait for Silvish to come.
Do I have to press this, or is it on? Is it on? Are you the guru? Oh, superb. I'm going to look at you anyway. Are we ready to go? Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for turning out this afternoon on a nice, sunny, windswept afternoon in St Andrews in late May. It's testament, I think, to the great attractions posed by our speaker. A much overdue visit, I have to say, long overdue visit by Professor Ervand Abrahamian, who doesn't really need much introduction to those of you here who are all studying the history and politics of modern Iran. But I will take the opportunity just to go through a little bit of his great achievements, literary and written achievements over the past few years. Achievements which I have to say we have all... Excuse me for 1 minute. Achievements which I have to say we have all learnt and built upon. He is one of the few giants really in the field of modern Iranian history, and one which I think really in his past work has laid the template and really the sort of the model for the rest of us to follow. For those of you who've been in my classes, and certainly those of Silvish and others, and we've done modern history, you'll know that Ervand's seminal books, in particular his Iran Between Two Revolutions, which was published in 1982, became a standard text for the study of modern Iran, particularly not only in the depth of its analysis, but the rigor of its methodology, which was really quite strikingly new in some ways for the field of Iranian history. But it was built on the back of a number of extremely impressive articles, thoughtful, perceptive articles that drew on the Western traditions of historical thinking and applied them to the Iranian model, the crowd in Iranian politics for one, but also for those of you, as I said, who've done my classes, his Oriental Despotism, the case of Raja Iran, is truly, in my view, one of the few really seminal articles to have been written on Iranian history, and one that I have always considered to be an essential part of anyone's reading list. Today he's going to talk to us about the roots, the 1953 roots of the revolution of 1979. It's a topic that, for those of you who are familiar with his oeuvre, will know that this is something very close to his heart, and one that we're very much looking forward to his insights. He will speak, I think, for around 45, 50 minutes. Then we will open up to a response by Dr. Ranjvar Daimi, who will be the sort of discussant, and then open up really to the floor. And we really look forward to all your questions to Professor Abrahamian. We very much hope, and I will say this to you now, Ervand, I hope, while this is the first of your visits to the University of St Andrews, it certainly won't be your last. And I hope now that you have more time on your hands and you don't have to bother with all the difficulties and interest of teaching lovely, wonderful students in New York, that you will pay more frequent visits here, where we can hopefully host you for longer periods of research as much as you'd like. But in any case, could you please show your appreciation and welcome Professor Abrahamian to St Andrews.
Thank you, Ali, for the introduction, and thank you for inviting me to St. Andrews. It's my first visit here, but I have to confess, a long time ago when I was looking for universities, it was my first choice. But powers that be decided I should go elsewhere. So I'm glad that I'm finally in St. Andrews. As you probably realize, it's 40 years since the revolution, but the Iranian Revolution still draws a lot of fascination, and for good reason. If you look at real revolutions in history, there are not that many. The word revolution is always used as sponge word these days for things such as riots, revolts, palace coups, civil wars, wars of national liberation. But if you take the word, what it really meant after the French Revolution, and the best definition I can find of crystallizing what the word revolution meant is by an Australian political scientist, Eugene Kamenka. A long time ago, he described revolution as a very sudden, rapid transformation of power from one social group to a very different social group, accompanied with basically change in the government, in the political system, change in the social system, social structure, and also in a political official ideology. So if you take a revolution in that way, and of course revolution is often accompanied with some violence, but also political participation, mass participation, then if you look at history, there are not that many revolutions. In fact, Thomas Carlyle, writing in his classic on the French Revolution, he says, well, this was a transformative event, but fortunately it will only occur once in a millennium. Okay, this is an exaggeration, clearly, but if you look at actually the number of true revolutions since the French Revolution, it's at most a handful. And the Iranian Revolution really fits into that model. You have a dramatic change in social group in power, you have a transformation in political ideology, in the regime, and so on. And of course, as a result of that, you have a great deal of migration of people forced out of the country. You have also, of course, a lot of political participation. One American political scientist argues that there was more political participation in the Iranian Revolution than even other revolutions, including the Russian. So for these reasons, the Iranian Revolution actually, I think, draws a lot of attention. Of course, there are other reasons. It's the first revolution that was televised. We have so many sources, first-hand accounts of it. We have government documents now basically provide fuel for any academic to study it. And as a result of that, of course, there's a lot of academic works, people applying their own special model to the Iranian Revolution. So you can say their application of Weberian model, structural functional model, behavioral model, rentier state model, you name it, you can find some political scientist that has used that model to explain what happened in the Iranian Revolution. What, of course, when you look at much of the models that explain it, they're usually the author stresses that this is a revolution that was unexpected, that people did not expect this revolution. If you look at the government reports, from Britain or United States, all the way into 78, they're not predicting a revolution. In fact, I found a recent document in the Foreign Office archive saying, well, yeah, the Foreign Office saying, well, we didn't expect a revolution, but even Fred Halliday didn't expect a revolution, so don't blame us. It was completely out of the blue. It was something not really expected. This is an exaggeration, actually. If you go outside conventional wisdom, there were plenty of people who were calling that the revolution was inevitable. In fact, they said it so often it became like a wolf crying that people did really eventually, even they themselves didn't believe it. But there were people, especially in the student movement, who annually said the revolution is around the corner. And if you go to an Arctic journal, offbeat art journal like Monthly Review, in 1973 there was an article saying that, well, the Iranian elite considers the masses as asses, but asses have a nasty habit of overturning apple carts, and the Iranian masses have a nasty habit of interrupting into politics in unexpected times. So you have, if you could say, the conventional wisdom very much was this was unexpected, and for good reason. After all, in 1978, the Shah had a major, formidable structure, power. He had a huge army, one of the largest armies in the Middle East, 400,000 men, huge bureaucracy of something like 300,000 civil servants. You had the creation of a new one-party state. There was, of course, the inflow of the petrodollars after 73. So from all those basically cards on the table, you could say this was a formidable regime. How could it collapse? Yet we do have this problem of this whole system did in 17 months completely unravel. What was seen as a formidable, impregnable fortress within 18 months really collapsed like a pack of cards. So the obvious question for a historian becomes, how does one explain this? And many of the writings, political scientist writings and historian writing after 79, looked at what I would call basically short-term causes or middle-range causes. And here again, there's a very interesting article written by Lawrence Stone, who wrote actually on the English Revolution. And he studies basically theories of revolution. And he argues that to understand causes of revolution, you have to separate what would be triggerous, short-term causes, from middle-range causes, then from what he would call fundamental causes, the prerequisites for revolution. And a lot of the writing on Iran, on the revolution, actually focuses on what I would call the triggerous. They're really not the causes. They're something I could say the last straw that broke the camel's back. They don't look at what I would going to argue is the fundamental cause, which is 53. But they look at things such as, they're all valid things to look at, but I don't think they really explain much. Things such as, for instance, there was a slight dip in oil revenues. And this is then exaggerated that there was an economic crisis and this unraveled the system. And the Shah even buys this argument that there was a Western conspiracy to lower the oil prices to destroy him. But if you look at still had huge reserves of foreign reserves, could have easily borrowed money. If there was any economic problems, it was caused by the oil boom rather than the slight oil thing. But people who are interested in the idea of rentier state have picked up on this explanation to say, here, when you have a slight fall in oil prices, this causes a revolution. Of course, that doesn't make sense because plenty of other countries survived decline in oil revenues. Another argument is about the Shah's vacillation, that if he didn't have cancer, he would have been able to weather the storm. Again, if you have cancer, you can think quite clearly. In fact, nothing sharpens one's mind to knowing that your time is limited. So this argument, and of course the drugs he was using was not going to inhibit his thinking. And also his vacillation is not basically the cause of the revolution, it's a product of the revolutionary situation that he didn't know what to do. Another argument that is often given is that there was a lot of inequality in Iran, which was true. But again, does inequality itself produce a revolution? If so, then most countries would be in permanent state of revolution, including my United States. Here, actually, I found an interesting remark made by Trotsky on the Russian Revolution. He says if deprivation was enough to cause revolution, then most countries would be in a permanent state of revolution. So you need something more than that. Another argument given about Iran is, well, there was a great deal of corruption. Again, yes, there was corruption, but again, does corruption itself cause a revolution? Again, in the United States, there's a great deal of corruption, probably even more than in Iran at that time, but it obviously is not causing people to go out in the street to protest. So these issues that are obviously valid issues, when you look at them, it doesn't really explain why this formidable system would collapse so quickly, especially since those factors were there before, they existed as well, even on a greater extent. Another argument that is often given, again a short-term argument, is the human rights or pressure on the Shah. And this was, of course, became a political issue in the United States, the Republicans arguing that the Democrats lost Iran because Carter pressured the Shah on human rights. Again, the human rights issue was important, but again, to think of it, was this enough to bring down a regime? What was the human rights pressure? It actually wasn't from the Carter administration, it was from International Commission of Jurists. And what they got the Shah to do was to stop torture in prisons and also change reform in the judicial system. So if someone was accused politically, they would go to a civilian court rather than a military court. So this was really the total uptake of the human rights pressure. Well, why should a system collapse just because you can't torture prisoners in prison? What sort of system is it that actually brings down the system just because of these minor reforms? So a lot of the arguments that are used to explain the revolution, I would say there is some legitimacy, but the problem is they're really short-term causes, the triggerers of the revolution. And what you find is when the crisis really starts, and basically the protests begin, what the regime is faced with is lack of legitimacy. That it can't really deal with the opposition because much of the opposition doesn't consider the regime as legitimate. There's one interesting diplomat, American diplomat, who was actually the substitute ambassador in the last days. And he doesn't really deal with the causes of the revolution, but he admits in his memoirs that during the revolutionary period, the Shah couldn't really deal with the opposition because the opposition leaders, none of them considered the regime as legitimate. And of course, the Shah himself knew that. So that if you're trying to deal with someone in the opposition, even if they'd had the organization and so on, there was no understanding because there was the lack of legitimacy. Now, this is interesting that this diplomat doesn't go into explain why there was the lack of legitimacy. But I would argue that the lack of the legitimacy really goes back to 1953. Why is this important? often people think that the oil crisis was to do about dollars and cents or pounds or pennies, whatever. That was about income. It was much more than that. The oil crisis and the nationalization of oil was really the Iranian equivalent for calling for national independence. After World War II, when more and more countries gained their independence from the former colonial powers, they put up their own flag, the new independent state, and so on. Although Iran has never been a typical colony, in Iran it was always viewed as a semi-colony of Britain. Why? Because the oil company was so important, controlled the main assets, and people's view was that basically the British then controlled the politicians. This had been sometimes true, especially in the 19th century. Of course, it wasn't so true under Reza Shah, but it became also true actually after 1942, when under the occupation. So it wasn't pure paranoia that the British pulled the strings behind the scenes. And therefore, I think for the Mossadegh and the national movement, the call for nationalization was more than just a question of getting higher money for the oil. It was a way of getting independence, of declaring independence. And it was seen at that time, both in Iran internationally and even Britain, as a national, basically, declaration of independence. So when the oil was nationalized, you have pouring of letters from third world countries, like from India, basically congratulating Iran for becoming independent. When Mossadegh went to the UN, he was actually received as a sort of a newly independent country. That's why a lot of the new countries actually supported Iran, because they saw this again as an anti-imperial power. Even in the Daily Telegraph, if you read the conservative press then in Britain, the coming down of the oil company flag and the Iranian flag replacing it, was seen as again as a declaration of independence. As a footnote, to counter that, the RAF flew a squadron over Abadan to show, okay, you can remove our flag, but we still have the power to bomb you if necessary. So it was seen very much as a colonial versus anti-colonial movement. So for Iranian nationalists, this basically mobilized the country because this was seen as more than just an oil concession or an oil fight. It was seen as a way of getting independence. This is often forgotten, that's why I'm stressing it now. Even in Iran nowadays, people argue, well, Mossadegh could have come to an agreement if he had just basically settled with some of the offers they made. He would have got more money, there would have been no coup, everything would have been different. But actually, I've argued elsewhere, Britain and the United States never offered a compromise to Mossadegh. Always the discussion was that, sure, you can claim that you have nationalized oil, but we will run the oil company for you and basically give you good revenues, but we will decide how the company is going to be run. And he wasn't willing to settle for this, and this basically led to the coup. Now, in this crisis, actually, the Shah's role is much more interesting than usually given. After the 79 revolution, especially in American diplomatic papers, he is always blamed as a Hamlet figure who couldn't make up his mind, a weak character. What I find in the earlier 51, 54 documents, not so much as a Hamlet tragic figure, he's more like actually a Greek tragic figure, tragedy, where the main person knows that if they do something, they are doomed. But they still have to do it because the stars or destiny leads them to do that fatal thing. In the Iranian case, it's not obviously the stars and destiny, it's the two imperial powers basically force the Shah to do something that he doesn't want to do because he knows if he does it, he is doomed. And what is it? It's basically participation in the coup. And what the Shah comes out across as actually a very shrewd politician, a much more shrewd politician than the diplomats and other Iranians, politicians were at that time. Right from the beginning, he knows he cannot go against Mossadegh and the oil nationalization. In fact, even before the oil bill is finalized, George McGee, who was Truman's special, basically, ambassador to Iran on the oil crisis, rushes to Iran to talk the Shah out of signing the bill. They misunderstood the Iranian constitution. The Shah was not in a position at that time not to sign. But McGee, when he gets to Tehran, discovers the mood is such that there's no way the Shah cannot sign. And there is, right from the beginning, a very consistent policy the Shah expounds to Henderson, the American ambassador. And I'm going to read it. It's not in good English because it was all in a cable form. But it really sums up the attitude of the Shah towards the whole crisis. Henderson writes, "My talk with the Shah lasted more than 2 hours. The Shah did not hide his great anxiety and distress at what he considered his helplessness. The Shah insisted that national sentiment was aroused against Britain and rallied behind Mossadegh as valiant defender of Iran's interest. The Shah said that the British tell me that I should be a strong man and take resolute action, but these so-called strong men, like my father, Hitler, and Stalin, took a resolute and bold action only when they knew that national sentiment was behind them. They never moved against basic feelings of their people. In this case, national sentiments are against Britain. I cannot take unconstitutional move against strong current national feelings. I'm convinced that attempt my part to remove Mossadegh would give his friends and my enemies opportunity to convince Iran's public that Crown had degenerated into mere British tool and such prestige as Crown has would disappear." And what you find actually right from beginning to really to the last months of August 1953, the British and the Americans are pressuring the Shah to get rid of Mossadegh. At first they pressure him basically to use the constitutional means, parliament, to do it. Once that fails, they resort to military action. But the Shah basically is always consistent. If he goes against the movement, he is basically dooming the monarchy because national sentiments are for Mossadegh and nationalization. Here actually there's a lot of interesting in the new documents that have come out of how the US tried to persuade the Shah to go along with the coup. Eventually they say, that they give him an ultimatum. They say, we're going to go along with the coup, although they know it's tricky because they need his image and his name to get army officers. They know Zahedi basically has, to use their term, no assets. Zahedi was a lot of big talker, but he really didn't have the military capability. The Shah had enough reputation among younger officers to carry out the coup. But the Shah, to the last moment, was very unwilling to do it because he was aware that this would be actually undermining the monarchy. What they eventually argued was that we're going to go with the coup if you don't go with the coup, we can't guarantee your throne. Maybe one of your brothers would be more suitable. So Ghulam Reza was sometimes thrown out as a name that would be more suitable. So here you find, again, you can say he was vacillating, Hamlet-like figure, but I would say he's much more of a shrewd politician who knows that this is something like it's a fatal act to do to go against the nationalization. So after 53, he has the power, but he is basically in an untenable position that he doesn't have the legitimacy. He's not only participated in coup, he's participated in overthrowing a national figure, the symbol of Iranian nationalism, and in a way undermined the achievement of independence, the nationalization. So I would call that as the original sin of the Pahlavi, of the second Pahlavi regime. And interestingly enough, I mean, the American archives, also the British archives, often talk about the fragility of the regime, although it looked formidable. They often mention things such corruption and so on. But they often say the system is fragile because it lacks really solid grounding. They rarely mention, or they also sometimes mention that Mossadegh remains very popular. But they never actually mention what the problem of the regime was, 53 coup. And there might be legal reasons for this, but I was curious in looking at the archives. It's like an Orwellian script where you can talk about, a diplomat can talk about the regime and problems and stuff. They can talk even about the events of 53. But the term coup and MI6 or CIA involvement in the coup is not there. It's not accidental. I think there might be legal reasons why a diplomat couldn't do it, even an analyst couldn't do it within the system. The Official Secrecy Act. So I mean, if you knew something about it and you put it in that there was a 53 coup by the US, and you could actually, I think in theory, be then taken to court for violating Official Secrecy Act. I'm sure the similar thing exists in the American system. So what you get is, in the diplomatic papers, 53 coup is actually just Orwellianly, I could say, burnt or shredded, to use a modern term. Just to a couple of vignettes to illustrate this. When the revolution started in '78, there was a Labour Party annual conference. And a Labour MP wrote to the Foreign Office saying, there's an Iranian here named Rotbi, passing around a pamphlet saying that we had something to do with the 53 coup. Is there some truth in this? So the Foreign Office assigns an intern to go through the archives to find out what there is. And the intern, I think must have been a young person, didn't know much personal history, comes back and says, I can't find anything. All I can find is Avery's book about, there has a chapter on the events of this, and Avery's book actually is just outlandish history. I mean, he says, he ends up the chapter with an invented story of Mossadegh pulling the blanket over his bed when the Sherman tanks are bombing his building, saying, laughing and say, Gigi, look at what I've done. I mean, that becomes the official interpretation of 53 coup. So here, you could say there was no official acceptance of what 53 was, or how important it was. Actually, the intern didn't look properly. If the intern had looked properly, they would have found that right after the coup, the British ambassador, being a good diplomat, basically wrote a memo to other ambassadors saying, if you really want to know what happened in '53, look at these series of articles in the India Times. And there was a reporter from India Times who was visiting Iran and probably knew the Indian ambassador. So he basically kept his ears open and eyes open. He was savvy enough to make links between the dots and stuff. And he actually gets a very good analysis of what happened in the coup. He had no access to secret documents. He didn't have to wait for historians like us 40 years later to look at it. He got the story right. So what the ambassador was saying is, if you already want to know what happened, go and look at this Indian journalist writer. He wasn't therefore admitting that there was a British coup, but saying, but here is the truth. There basically, you can find out what you want. So there are various inklings here and there in the documents, but there's very much self-conscious not mentioning it. On the American side, just to give you two vignettes, that lack of information, not just the average person in the street, but among diplomats. When I started writing a book on the coup, a former diplomat emailed me, said, you know, I was trained to go and work in the embassy. I was trained in Persian. I studied a lot of history of Iran. I went to Iran, this was in the 50s. He says, it wasn't until 1960, talking to an Iranian student, that I discovered that the US had a role in the '53 coup. So here is someone actually in the profession had basically, was not aware of that situation. Another vignette that actually illustrates the cultural gap. A senior diplomat recently revealed that when he was in the embassy in Iran, this would have been 10 years after the coup, he was studying Persian with an aristocratic lady. And one day he asked his teacher, the aristocratic lady, who's your favorite Iranian politician? And she, without hesitation, said, Mossadegh. And he said, well, Mossadegh's been gone for 10 years. She said, yes, I know, you Americans took him away from us. And so he admits that if this well-heeled lady thinks this way, I wonder what the rest of the country thinks about that. So here you could say, as far as the West was concerned, '53 could be then relegated as a footnote. But of course, for most Iranians, especially politically conscious Iranians, '53 was very much there. It wasn't a long-term history, ancient history. It was a very formative event in recent history. And I think you find also inklings of this in the Shah's thinking. In Alam's diary, he writes that actually the Shah was kept on being obsessed about Mossadegh, even at the height of his power. Andrew Cooper's written a recent book on the Shah. It's more like a court history of the Shah. But again, he admits that the Shah's nemesis was, of course, Mossadegh. So why? I think it already goes back to '53. So what you find here, I would say, is the lack of legitimacy is really the weakness of the regime after '53. And often, you know, there are all these post-mortems on post-mortems. You'll find both in the British and American diplomatic reports, there is sometimes, I mean, of course, they say the Shah is doing great things, but they say there's these problems, but they never really deal with the core issue of 53 and the loss of legitimacy. So even Parsons says that, you know, at the time of the big celebrations of 96, that this, the Shah is acting as if it's a, you know, a great emperor, but the system is fragile. He doesn't go to explain why it's fragile, but again, there is an awareness that under what looks solid, there is a lot of fragility. So what the Shah tries to do, I think, to get legitimacy after 53, in a way, undermines further legitimacy, because these are often sort of somersaults, political somersaults, to somehow grab onto some other form of legitimacy. So one form of legitimacy was, of course, 2,500-year history, trying to attach himself, the Pahlavis, to 2,500 years of Iranian history, and basically legitimacy being on that line. This, I would say, further alienated people, especially secular nationalists, because this was, again, sort of misuse of nationalism. It, of course, then it alienated religious people, because this was seen as undermining religion. It wasn't really, I don't think that was the intention, but it was interpreted as a way of undermining Shiism to talk about pre-Islamic Iran. Another form of legitimacy, getting legitimacy, is to become a great revolutionary leader by inaugurating the White Revolution. So it was basically saying, okay, I'm not maybe a Mossadegh, but I'm greater than that because I'm bringing about a Bismarckian revolution from above. Again, I think this counter created a backlash and ended up actually further discrediting the system. Another way of becoming, getting legitimacy was basically to become a great military power in the Middle East by building up a large army, navy, becoming a force even in the Indian Ocean. This, again, on paper could seem like, okay, he's becoming a powerful state. But this, again, undermined the system because for nationalists, he was becoming not a gendarme, but American gendarme of the region. This actually then reinforced the view that he was a puppet of the Americans because he's doing what the Americans want to do. This proves that he was put in power in 53 in order to become the American puppet. So all these, I think, are these sort of jugestic somersaults of the regime were a way to compensate for 53, to get some sort of alternative grounding for legitimacy. And they obviously didn't work. So when you have a slight crisis, and none of these crises were human rights, the decline in oil prices, these are not basically a crisis that would bring down a normal regime. But they did bring down this regime because of the fundamental issue of lack of legitimacy. Now, another thing that actually, the question of legitimacy is important is a Weberian concept. Weber never ended up writing about revolutions. Weber was interested in institutions, bureaucracies, longevity of basically systems. But he at one point promised to write something on revolution. He never got to it. The closest thing he came to writing about revolution was some articles on the Russian 1905 revolution, which are actually for an academic interesting because there Weber is not Weberian. When he looks at the Russian 1905, he becomes more of a Marxist interpreter he uses actually mostly Menshevik sources to understand what's going on. So I think clearly he argues that the Weberian system doesn't really explain revolutions. But I think there is an important part of Weber that's interesting. For Weber, there are basically three sources of legitimacy. There's, you can say, the traditional custom. Then there's the bureaucratic sort of what you could say rational, modern, whatever modern means. But when there is neither of those, you have a vacuum. And it's in the vacuum situation where you have the appearance of charisma. Charisma being somehow someone who has authority, but the authority doesn't come from tradition or bureaucracy. It's more like biblical. Old Testament is from God or from above. And here it fits very much into Khomeini's basically actions. People see Khomeini as creating the revolution. He's more a product of the revolution because I would argue the lack of legitimacy, the old system had broken down. You have then emergence of a character who claims that now he has the authority. He's not concerned about normality, custom, tradition. He is going to create the new form of legitimacy. And that then provides a sort of a new fuel for what's happening in 77, 78. That authority now is coming from somehow above, beyond tradition and so on. Now, to end up, you can argue then, one can object, 53, long period from 79, and it's not just the gap. I would say the gap is not historically important for Iran, but there is a gap in terms of discourse. The political discourse of 51, 53 is very different from the discourse of 1976, 78, 79. The former one is predominantly based on nationalism, secularism, the constitution. The second one is based much more on Khomeini's interpretation of Shiism. So you could say, well, what's the connection if the discourse is so different? How can you connect 79 to 53? I would argue that what actually 53 did is in a way also ended the old discourse. It showed the failure or apparent failure of the constitutionalism, the nationalist, secular discourse. And what then came later, gradually, was a much more different discourse, actually critical even of the old discourse. But despite that, what the Khomeinis also shared with nationalists is the lack of respect for the system, because they knew that it was legitimate because of the coup. So even the clerics who had participated in the coup were in fact by the 70s were critical of the coup or didn't want to admit that they were part of the coup. So that issue still, of course, is very controversial, how far Kashani actually played a role in the coup and so on. I don't think he actually played a role, but people on either side want to make him part of the important role of the coup. Ayatollah Bey Bahani probably played a role. Burujerdi certainly did not play a role. And the clerics as a whole, I would say, did not play a role. A few did, but on the whole, you can't accept a royalist argument that the coup was really not a military coup, but a clerical coup, and all the blame should be put on the mullahs that brought down Mossad there. So that becomes a sort of topical, controversial issue nowadays. But the real issue is, during the revolution, basically it was hard to find anyone either within the clerics or the secular opposite, left or centralist, who viewed the Shah system as legitimate. And the lack of legitimacy really goes back to 53. And I would say the Shah's shrewdness was that he knew that 53 was in fact a very important issue. And the fact that he was so reluctant to participate in it is a sort of sign of his intelligence, but also his miscalculation of the situation. So I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. So can I ask Siavush to come and do a quick response? Then we'll open the floor to questions. I have a few questions of my own, you'll be pleased to know. But we'll hopefully get a good discussion there.
Sure.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Professor Abrahamian. This was a very interesting and wide-ranging discussion. I will briefly comment on some of the notes made. First of all, I do agree whenever I teach the revolution, one has to mention that this is possibly the last big revolution in world history. And the reason is that, of course, we have to look at what happens after the revolutionary process in particular to gauge whether a certain event can be classified as a complete change in the status quo, as revolutions are. Of course, when on February 11th, 2011, right on the day of the Iranian Revolution, the Tahrir Square movement was victorious, and Hosni Mubarak's rule in Egypt came to an end. I remember there was a big party going on at SOAS to celebrate the Egyptian revolution. And everybody called it a revolution. And I sort of told my friends that we have to be a bit careful and wait to see whether the events in Egypt of that year are really a revolution. Well, if you look at Egypt right now, it's more or less the system it was, I guess, during Mubarak's time, during Sadat's time, during Nasser's time, the military strongman at the helm. So the Iranian Revolution is different because we are sitting here and celebrating or commemorating, or in a way, holding a talk on its 40th anniversary. It was really a deep transformation, and it's still quite baffling in certain aspects. One thing that always struck me of the Iranian Revolution is that pretty much until the 11th of February 1979, the state didn't collapse, and the state was functioning, more or less. There were strikes, of course. There were moments in which basic services were interrupted, famous queues in petrol stations. But for example, if you look at the newspapers covering the Jaleh Square massacre, Black September, you look at these newspapers, they have these gory details of Jaleh Square, of the number of deaths and more, and you look at the ads on the newspaper at the top of these newspapers, and you see that the Iran Air is advertising in those same dates 19 flights a week from Mehrabad Airport to Heathrow Airport in London. And that number today is, of course, as we know, 3. So the state was going on, many services were going on, and in the midst of this there was a revolution. So this creates, I think, an analytical challenge for us. How can we discuss a revolution which went on for a full calendar year before the state finally came to an end, before the Shah left, before the rest of the state system, whatever was left, progressively came to a halt, and the 11th of February, finally, the white flag was raised. Professor Abrahamian, I think, takes what we could call a long view, because rather than focusing on the short view that many others focus on, 77, 78, 79, maybe going a bit further back in the 70s, he says that 1953 has a lot to do with it. I agree, but I would like to raise an issue that is important here, and it is the issue of alienation. The alienation of the regime from society, which we see in 78 and 79. And I think that is an important reason for this revolution. The fact that when Bakhtiar comes to power, and when he tries actually to mobilize his own supporters, and when he tries to rally his own crowd at Amjadiyeh Stadium in a famous rally that was billed as the pro-constitution rally, only several thousand people come out. The crowds that come out are uncomparable in size to the crowds of Ashura, Taswa, of the big moments of the revolution where a considerable larger amount of people came out. So how do we get there? How do we get to the fact that when the Shah's regime at some points during 1978, and particularly at the beginning of the 1979 in Bakhtiar's government, tries to mobilize people, so many people come out? And I think much has to do, of course, with 1953 and the progressive lack of legitimacy of the regime from that moment onwards. We shouldn't forget that Mossadegh remains in the public sphere in one way or the other until the Amini government of the early 60s. That's the last instances in which Mossadegh gets coverage in the press, and photos of Mossadegh appear in Kayhan and Itlaat and the major Iranian newspapers. It is during the premiership of Ali Amini, who is often informally, but I think correctly remembered as the last prime minister of the Shah, was not a sort of a servant of the Shah as well. So that is the moment in which I think the Shah parts ways with the politicians of 1951 to 53, to the remnants of that political season and that political scene who were not directly involved in agitation against the Shah. Or for example, like the Tudeh were not linked to the Tudeh that the Shah just decided to repress. So in the earlier 1960s, you have remnants of the National Front. You have people like Ghulam Hussein Sadeghi, even Mehdi Bazargan, Allahyar Saleh, and many others who were prominent members of the Mossadegh administration, who still are on the fringes of public life, who are trying to put together in the midst of many internal contradictions, the National Front again. And the National Front, of course, was not a revolutionary movement at the time. It was respecting the Mashruta constitution. But this fails. It fails both because of their internal divisions, because of the fact that the Shah was not really open to forms of even that form of minor pluralism, and also because a new actor emerges on the scene in the form of Khomeini and his opposition to the White Revolution, to aspects of land reform, which leads to the June 1963 uprising. So I think the early 60s is a moment in which Mossadegh and the Mossadegh generation of politicians are deprived the chance of playing a non-negligible role in national politics. And they enter into the state of limbo and this sort of long crossing of the desert, which lasts until the late 70s, pretty much. Until 1977, when Jimmy Kerassi, as it is known in Iran, I mean the policies of Carter, that was actually the term that was used in jail by the political prisoners of the time, results in this thawing. And as part of the thawing, of course, we have the reemergence on the scene of Mossadegh and the whole legacy of Mossadegh. And it is interesting that in the autumn of 1978, when some of the press that had been banned by the Shah's regime for a number of years, for example, the prominent weekly Tehran Musawwar, they start publication again. Right in the midst of the major press strike of the autumn of 1978. The very first cover of Tehran Musawwar in that period is a big portrayal of Mossadegh, of course. And this was a daring act, because this was reintroducing Mossadegh in a way to a generation of young rebels who had never, of course, witnessed him in person. But, of course, that was the moment in which the legacy of 1953 becomes a complicated issue. Because until the early 60s, there was only one gatekeeper, if you want, to the Mossadegh legacy and the Mossadegh persona, and that was the National Front. In 1978, this changes, and the radical groups that emerge in the scene in the 60s start to lay claim to Mossadegh in their own way. So the Mujahideen Khalq do this, as of course Professor Abrahamian describes even in his book, Radical Islam. The Fadayan Khalq do this, and many other movements. So the legacy of 1953, in my view, in 1978, in the midst of the rebels, becomes rather fragmented. And it becomes a key point of contention. So much so that nobody really, I think, especially in the early period after the revolution, in the spring and summer of 1979, nobody really capitalizes on being able to portray themselves as the real continuation of Mossadegh's line. And of course, what's left of the National Front, Shapur Bakhtiar, Karim Sanjabi, Dariush Furuhar, those people that in 1977 re-emerge as the National Front and try to re-establish the Mossadegh mystic and Mossadegh mantra, shatter really badly on this whole issue of whether to back the constitution or become revolutionaries. And some of them become reluctant revolutionaries, others stay loyal to the constitution to the very end. So we see how in 1979, the ghost of Mossadegh, if you want, lingers on and is there in the background, re-emerges in 1978 in the public sphere, and then progressively enters into this period of very contested legacies. But to conclude my sort of remarks, I do agree that one of the main reasons for 1978 is not a systemic one. It's not a famine or a conflict or some phenomena which weakened the state considerably and caused it to be unable to provide basic services and basic goods and create a rebellious movement because of this, as that was one of the reasons, at least, of the Russian Revolution. However, this issue of lack of legitimacy starts in 1953, has this moment in which the Shah maybe could have done something about it during Amini's rule if he had opened up a bit to the National Front, and rears its head one last time, in my view, within the rubric of forces that are willing to reform and respect the Constitution rather than rebel and be revolutionary in 1977. When open letters are written against the Shah or regarding or against the prevailing problems, political prisoners, political repression, economic turmoil, corruption, and so on and so forth, by a group of people who repeatedly are telling to the Shah that we want to reform. We want a reform system, we want corrections to be made, and the tone of these letters is unequivocally reformist. The Shah ignores them. Then the apex of dissidents of that period is the Goethenites of 1977. Following that, students want to engage in more in the continuation of the Goethenites in the Iranian University and elsewhere. This is repressed by Savak in a heavy-handed way, and we get to the start of the Rashidi Mutlag article and the start of the revolution. So in three different episodes, the Shah progressively undermines his legitimacy and creates, I think, the conditions for 1979. These were my comments. Thank you.
Do you have any response?
Yeah, I like it.
Yeah, go on.
My argument wouldn't be so much the importance of Mossadegh as a person or how, it's so much his image. It's more the fact that the Shah came to power after a military coup organized by Britain and the United States. That becomes, I think, the core problem. So that later on, how Mossadegh is remembered or not, that becomes less important. In fact, very few people, either in the left or clerics in '79, had respect for Mossadegh. Their argument was that, in fact, if Mossadegh was too liberal, he should have dealt with these guys, take them out and shoot them. We wouldn't have had a coup. And I've heard actually very liberal supporters of Mossadegh saying, yeah, but Mossadegh's problem was that he didn't execute these guys. after the first failure. And Mossadegh, in fact, said, I'm not in the business of executing people. So it's not so much the image of Mossadegh. It's more what brought the Shah to power was 53. So I would then argue that, and of course, the American diplomats often said the Shah should have liberalized at this period or that period. The two problems with that. With modern politics, we know that autocrats who become more autocratic don't necessarily lose popularity. They might, in fact, become more popular. So I don't think autocracy itself undermines a system. But if you don't have legitimacy, when you're trying to negotiate with even so-called reformers, I don't want to sound apologetic to the Shah, but he knew these guys, whether you're talking about Sanjabi or even Amini, they didn't consider the system as legitimate. So he knew sooner or later in negotiations, the question is going to come out, what gives you the authority to order this? According to the Constitution, the Shah should reign, not rule. So that ought to become a problem. So even with moderate National Front, there would have been at a time when the problem of legitimacy came in. So one could say, well, the Shah should have opened up to the National Front at this time or that time. The problem, I think, would have been that you can open up with an opposition that really considers you legitimate, but if it doesn't, then you have a real problem. And there are times when the Shah says, actually, the National Front is worse than the communists. I mean, he was getting to the core, why? Because the National Front doesn't consider themselves as legitimate. Now, in terms of generation, you're right, by 79, there's a new generation. But what is interesting is in 79, the people who are telling Khomeini, don't compromise, just go ahead, the whole system is a sham. The whole system will collapse if you just call for the removal of the Shah. Who are they? They're not the old generation, or they're not even the clerics. They're three people. And these three people, I mean, they become the victims of revolution later on, but the three people are Ghorabzadeh, Bani Sadr, and Yazdi. Okay, who are they? They are products of 53. They are basically refugees after 53. They spend their whole lifetime as professional revolutionaries in the student movement. They consider the system illegitimate. Not only illegitimate, they consider it a pack of cards. This is what they've been saying every year since 53. So they have actually the most influence with Khomeini in that crucial period. When people like Bani Sadr are saying, go step by step, they are saying, go whole way, the whole system is basically going to collapse. And here actually, ironically, the student organization that's often been discredited, in many ways, because of these three people, I think did play a very important role in the revolution. And they're not clerics as such.
Now, how does this system work? You have to explain that.
I don't know. I think it should be.
It might be best if you stay at the podium.
Oh,
Is that all right? If you stay at the podium, and I will do my best to be
Yeah.
compare. So we're going to open up the floor to questions in a minute, but I just wanted to use chairman's privilege, if I may, and just ask you a couple of questions. One about the documents, which is quite interesting, and I think you're right on this, by the way. I think British diplomats, by and large, tend to smooth over or disguise or ignore, in some ways, the events of 53. I think some of them, in the 60s and 70s, probably the junior diplomats didn't really know or weren't really as aware as they could have been. But in 1978, I mean, there's no doubt that they did know what happened, because in 1978, the Americans are about to release all these documents on 1953, and they have to check with the British whether they're allowed to, and the British say, we'd rather you didn't. And I have to say, I do probably have sympathy with the British then, because to release these documents in September or October 78 was probably a very, very bad timing in terms of wanting to release documents on a covert operation in Iran in 1953. So clearly there was some knowledge, but I agree with you. I think when you read a lot of the British documents, there's an interesting, they talk about the events of, but they don't really go into a huge amount of detail. The one question from a methodological point of view really I have for you is whether do you think you're in danger of becoming over-deterministic really by seeing 1953 as this quintessential? I mean, there is an element where you can say that certainly for the sort of the National Front, the professionals, the secular nationalists, there is a crisis of legitimacy there, there's no doubt about it. I mean, you can see that, it's repeated in a lot of their statements. I tend to sort of see when talking with Siyavush and others, I mean, certainly in the 1950s, the Shah was often criticized for co-opting many National Front people into the administration as far as he could. And yes, certainly after 61, or certainly 63, I would say, when, quote, the White Revolution really gets launched, that they begin to fade away. And I would say certainly not just 63, but in the sort of the Status of Forces Convention in 1964 is the real sort of wedge, I think, that is created with the secular nationalists. But I'm just a little bit anxious to sort of see how you feel, for instance, if you were to come from an Islamist narrative, for instance, where you see obviously the start of the revolution is really starting with Khomeini's uprising, I suppose, in 1963, 64. Is the legitimacy of the regime not seen in purely Shia sort of rhetoric and narrative? And that Mossadegh doesn't really, the coup is secondary to that overarching. Or, for instance, in some ways, if you're coming from a far more leftist sort of view, you have a theory of revolution and about the role of the monarch as a sort of very traditional and archaic. He's illegitimate because he's a monarch. I mean, basically, he's not modern. So there are a series of illegitimacies, if I can put it that way, that simply sort of looking at the Mossadegh, the coup as the singular event or the singular moment, is that not, in a sense, are we not in danger in some ways of over-arguing the case, if I can put it that way?
I could say, I'm deterministic, but here actually the issue of, let's say, what happened in the 60s, Khomeini's argument, obviously, his discourse was the Shah is not Islamic. So that becomes the... But is that actually an argument that would have much mileage if it wasn't for 53? Because the arguments he used that he's not Islamic really don't hold much water. In what way is he not Islamic? I mean, he does everything that an Islamic monarch does. He goes to pilgrimages. He observes whatever needs to be observed. The Khomeini claims, well, he forces women to walk naked in the streets. Well, you'd find it hard to find anyone walking naked in the streets of Tehran. I mean, what it meant was that he was not forcing people to be covered. But you have to use a hyperbole to actually argue that he was not a Muslim. But the arguments that I think that hold water was the question of legitimacy. And here again, Khomeini, of course, became important not so much because of 63, but 64, with the question of capitulations, of giving special privileges to American military officials. This, I think, fitted into the narrative that the Shah was an American puppet, and basically it was doing what he was supposed to be doing from 53. So although Khomeini's, you could say, discourse was Islamic, the impetus is still very nationalistic. So I think that's what more resonated, even among Iranians who weren't that Islamic. About that in the 50s or early 60s, the Shah was willing to co-opt people. I don't know how genuine it was, because it wasn't really co-optation. There wasn't sharing of power. There was basically recruiting people into the system for them to basically save their souls, sell their souls for a job. And I think he knew that this was not really a strong pillar to rely on. These are not people who are going to actually fight for the regime. And you find more and more of that as you get new memoirs. New oral histories just come out. A guy called Ashtiani, who was spent years in Heidelberg, claimed he studied with Heidegger. He went to Iran, got a position in the university teaching philosophy, and when they wanted to create the Rastakhi's party, he was brought in as an expert on dialectics. So he created the notion that the Shah had a dialectical relationship with the people and so on. So, I mean, he thought this was a joke because he was born. But what's interesting is the same guy admits that a few years later, he was one of the people climbing up the statue to bring down the Shah statue. So this was the type of, you can say, co-optation that the regime had.
Right, so we'll open the floor to questions. Can I encourage also the students here, if you'd like to ask a question, have the courage, please, to ask a question. You won't get the opportunity again, not in the near future anyway. First over to a non-student.
Thank you, Professor Abrahamian, for your very interesting and fascinating talk. You summarized the theories of the causes of revolution, especially with the special reference to Iranian Revolution. I'm sure there are other factors as well have been mentioned about the roots of Iranian Revolution, and you mentioned some of them. And I do understand the issue of lack of legitimacy was very important. The factor of lack of legitimacy, especially after 1953 coup, was very important. Shah was seen as a puppet and not as a true Iranian genuine leader and king. I was just wondering, do we know whether it is the cause of Iranian Revolution or one of the major causes of Iranian Revolution, whichever you believe in, whether we have got other evidences from any other revolution in which lack of legitimacy has caused a social movement or revolution at all. I am asking this question because I am thinking probably there would be some people who would argue about the relevance of this cause to the current authority of the Islamic Republic. Many people would argue that they lack legitimacy, probably for different or probably even for opposite reasons. If Shah had lacked legitimacy for so-called secular reasons, probably they would say for religious reasons, the current authority would lack legitimacy. So the question would be, would it be relevant to the current regime, for example? Are we expecting another revolution in Iran? Thank you.
Nice, easy questions for you.
Yeah, actually, a very important, actually, interesting question, because obviously, with the crisis in Iran now, then the question is how stable is the regime? And then that automatically leads to, does it lack legitimacy or does it have legitimacy? I would say on one side, there is legitimacy. Why? First of all, it's a revolution that came to power in a revolution with a great deal of participation. So people who might be critical of the regime still consider the origins of the republic as legitimate. Then I think also we shouldn't estimate culture. I don't mean religion as sort of Shiism, but as a culture, it obviously does resonate for a lot of people. It may piss off a lot of people, but it also does resonate among general population. So that you find, and then also there's a nationalistic issue that as long as the country is threatened by abroad, people tend to rally around. That doesn't necessarily mean that they're willing to go and fight, but they tend to rally around whoever has the flag. And we saw that, of course, during the Iraqi war. So in those grounds, you can say there is legitimacy, and you find even people who were former activists in the revolution are now in the opposition. They still consider that overall the regime as legitimate. They would prefer having reforms in the system rather than overthrow the system. And another factor, actually, I think that gives legitimacy to the regime is what's the alternative? Especially what you've seen happening in Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, Syria. If the alternative is chaos and disintegration of the state, people might be able to live with the devil they know rather than the anarchy. I think Hobbes here is more relevant than anything else. So those things, I think, give it on one. Obviously, then on the other ground, there is increasing economic issues, which I would interpret actually in class terms, that especially middle class that had considerable benefits, especially in the after the revolution, these benefits have been eroded, and or they feel they've been eroded, and yeah, and there, so that the protests also, obviously economic protests, but whether they're actually threats to the legitimacy or whether they're just protests is different. I heard someone who'd actually worked with past stars. They claim that some of the things that go on internet, you know, that we want the Mujahideen back or we want the Shah back, that it's actually the past stars that put that up. They know it goes viral, but it serves their interest to have this type of viral publicity. And because revolutions don't happen very often, I would say I would give it durability to this regime. I mean, I think the better thing would be if the system actually opened up. I think, unlike the Shah, it has legitimacy, it can open up. It could even bring out more Savian people and out of prison, out of home prison and stuff. It would still survive, but I think there's a hardline notion that if you compromise, you have to give more concessions in the future and so on.
Thank you so very much for your brilliant talk about the Iranian Revolution. You gave us a very clear framework, actually, in understanding the causes of 1979 revolution. I have 3 questions. I'm going to ask them very, very shortly. And they are connected. Yes, they are very connected, actually. Okay. First is, how do you also, with regards to your answer to Siavash, you yourself mentioned that the nationalist secular discourse lost its hegemony during the decades before the 1979 revolution. How do you yourself explain this? Because you mentioned yourself, does it have to do with the Shah's efforts in making an alternative foundations for legitimacy that you listed for us, for instance? And the second question is that how did Shah finally accept the plan for coup, given his worries about the monarchy and the legitimacy? I mean, did he inevitably said, yes, okay, I have to agree with you if I don't have any other option? Russians. And the final question is that, did Shah ever wanted to make a compromise with the members of national movement, for instance, during the time of, Siavash mentioned, the Khalil Maliki talks and these sort of things, given that he was very well aware about the problem of legitimacy, so maybe he started to think maybe it's time for me to start some sort of coalition with this discourse of national movement, and that's
Very good. I'll take the second question first because it's the easiest. He finally said, the Shah finally agreed to participate in the coup with the ultimatum. Yeah. I'm not sure which name they were willing to use, Ghulam Reza or Ali Reza, but they basically said, you know, if you don't come along with us, you're not going to be on the throne. And of course, this doesn't come in the diplomatic papers. This is only in the CIA conversations. So you're not going to find actually anything in the real documents saying that the Shah was given this ultimatum. There is a meeting actually when their preparations for the coup, when Henderson interrupts and says, you know, you're not going to be able to carry out a coup, he tells the CIA, unless you have the Shah. And he says the only way, the Shah is reluctant, and the only way you can get the Shah is if you threaten that you'll replace him with Ghulam Reza. It's as blunt as that. Now, secular discourse, why it was lost. Well, there's actually, I would say, on an interglobal level, of course, the dominant discourses of early 20th century up to the middle century is different from after the 60s and so on. In the early period of the discourse, internationally, it's usually liberalism, constitutionalism, the Enlightenment, and Iran very much fitted into that. After the mid-century, you get a replacement by much more radical discourse, especially with third worldism, revolutionary liberation movements. And then after 67, the emergence of Islamism. So I think that Iran very much reflects that global shift. But there's another factor, I think, that the fact that Mossadegh was easily overthrown, then the lesson many people learned was that liberalism can't deal with imperialism unless it is tough, because it can easily be overthrown. And here there's an interesting speech by Khamenei when he was Imam Jomeh of Tehran. It was on the anniversary of Mossadegh's death. The National Front had organized a big rally. And clearly Khamenei didn't want to bring the name of Mossadegh. But he said, we're not liberals like Allende, who the CIA can snuff out. I.e., we deal with the opposition the proper way. We take them out and shoot them. Okay, we're not like Mossadegh. So I think there is that shift in the general attitudes, which isn't, I think it's a decline of basically liberal attitudes about politics and replacement by a much more tough-minded radical politics, whether it's left or right. So during the revolution, I mean, there were very few protests about the executions, the early executions. Even people you would expect to be actually repelled by it basically said, well, this is a revolutionary situation. It's expected that such things would happen. And the last talk about compromise. See, again, yeah, Shah occasionally would talk to someone like Khalid Maliki, but again, how much would he have trusted Khalid Maliki? There's also, I think there is a psychological issue besides 53. The Shah didn't really trust anyone. Okay, I think the notion that there's always someone ready to overthrow you is a sentiment there. You have to be always on the lookout behind your back, so that even people who risked their lives in 53, he's not willing to trust them. You look at actually the career of the officers who pulled off 53. I mean, if there are any heroes for royalists, it should be the tank officers of 53. But almost all of them become very much marginalized figures soon after it. The Shah's attitude was that if you're willing to carry out a coup on my behalf for the CIA, you might be willing to carry out a coup on behalf of the CIA against me in future. So someone like Bakhtiar gets assassinated. Gharani and people like that actually get accused of plotting overthrow and stuff. So there is really no core of people he can really trust. There's alam and people, but they don't have their independent source of power.
Hi, so I'm quite interested in the 1979 revolution and mostly the ethnic minority groups and their involvement in the revolution. So the Kurds, the Armenians, the Azeris, and even the Afro-Iranians, and how they were involved in the revolution. So if you could, like, I don't know, maybe, yeah. Because there isn't really much ever spoken about the ethnic minority groups and how they're involved in the revolution. So, and they do have quite, I suppose, prominent place in the Iranian civilization and society. So I was just wondering how they were involved.
Of the minorities? Well, there's much recent writing about role of the minorities in the revolution. But let's not get exaggerated. There was, obviously, you can find some people from the Armenian Jewish Zoroastrian community who participated, and especially in the war, fought in the war, became martyrs and so on. But, you know, we're talking about small numbers. And here you have to be definitely realistic. The revolution was very much, because the language of the revolution, the discourse, was Shiism. It obviously doesn't resonate well among Armenians, Assyrians, Zoroastrians, Jews. As Iranians, they might, you know, resonate when it's question of Iranian nationalism, but the predominant slogans of the revolution were definitely Shia. So I think it's an exaggeration to think that there was a great deal of participation of the minorities. They were more like bystanders. There was not very much support for the regime, but that doesn't mean they were eager supporters of Khomeini. I haven't found any myself, so I think there is, of course, in the communities, there's probably a pragmatic reason to exaggerate the participation of the minorities in the revolution. But I think numerically, when people got a chance, they voted with their feet rather than participation.
So my question relates again to present day situation. So essentially, American disdain towards Iran is based on the rather simplistic premise that, which seems to be sort of axiomatically accepted by by all in Washington, which is that Iran is the root cause of all evil in the Middle East, due to it being the sort of #1 state sponsor of terrorism, and for its sponsorship of proxy militias in the region. And this is all sort of according to American intelligence, which of course we don't have the access to at the minute. So my question would be, sort of, first of all, how reliable do you think these claims to be? And considering, well, I'm sort of asking this thinking about your 1953 book, which argues that sort of communism was a veil and was used in the CIA's documents to sort of force American action in between departments. So I was wondering if you see sort of parallels between the two, 53 and now, in terms of the sort of intelligence side of things.
Yes, actually, I mean, 53, the arguments were that the coup was needed because of the threat of communism. The documents, recent documents, actually show that there was no threat of communism. There's a report, CIA report, written actually 2 days before the coup, saying the Tudeh party was really in no position. It wasn't even thinking of a coup. So it was a way of justifying it. And it's actually still used as a justification, because when Albright first admitted US role, and then Obama admitted it, they always put it, but remember, it was in the context of the Cold War. So it may have been a bad thing, but there was a justification. But if you look at that time, people like the Dulles brothers would have justified anything on communism. They could have thrown their grandmothers under the bus and claimed that there was, we needed to save Iran communism. And Mossadegh actually joked about this. There's a discussion between Mossadegh and Henderson, where Mossadegh is trying to get a bargain for aid, and Henderson says, no, I can't go to Congress and ask for so much money for Iran. Mossadegh says, yes, you can, just tell him you're saving Iran from communism. And both of them laugh. They know it's a joke. But I noticed a recent student used this, saying that this was a terrible mistake because Mossadegh was using communism, and this fitted into the American system that there was a communist threat. So the discourse of the time was that. Here, the discourse now that the US is using is that the problems of the Middle East all really originate in Iran. And that before, the argument until recently was that, well, Iran had ambitions. It was either the nuclear ambitions or imperial ambitions to rebuild the old Achaemenid empire. You had even films made in Hollywood, Iran, the Iranian Persian army marching onto Sparta or Athens, burning down Sparta, that this was a recreation of the old aspirations. Of course, I think in Iran this would have considered bizarre anyway. But now the argument is, well, there are problems in the Middle East, and all these problems are now linked to Iran. Clearly, Iran has more influence in the Middle East now than it had 10 years ago or 15 years ago. But why? It's not because of Iranian power or aspirations. Is because of the problems mistakes US has made. So, I mean, destroying Iraq made Iran an important influence in Iraq, which it never had. Similarly, once the Taliban comes to power in Afghanistan, Iran obviously will have influence there, which it didn't have obviously before the American invasion. Then in Syria, sure, Iran had some influence with Assad in order to get equipment to Hezbollah. That's been there for a long time. But once the civil war started in Syria and US arms poured into Syria, then, of course, Assad became much more independent, much more dependent on Russia and Iran. So Iran's influence in Syria, I would say, is much greater now than before, but mainly because Assad was put under such pressure. So yes, Iran does have some influence, but how much is this influence? You know, sure, there's some militias in Iraq. There are Shia militias, even from Afghanistan, that Iran pays for. But this is fairly small pittance when you're talking about on a larger picture. It's not huge sums of money, huge numbers, I would say. And when they talk about Iranian threat, it's interesting, they never really talk about tanks, airplanes, weapons. Usually strategic designers, when they talk about military threat, they look at, you know, how much does this country have? Iran is militarily also really a fourth-rate power. It has soft power, you could say, but it doesn't have a military might. If you look at the budget, Iranian military budget is something like 9 to 10 billion a year. Saudi Arabia spends $110 billion. The UAE spends more than Iran spends. So you put even the Gulf states together, they spend twice as much as Iran. So how can that country be a threat to the neighbors when it doesn't really have the military capability? So the sort of arguments, the weapons of mass destruction argument they have, it comes out in the American press, is, well, Iran may not be a military power, but General Soleimani has diabolical powers. And this is important because, remember, in America, 30% of the population is Christian fundamentalist. When you use the word diabolical powers, it means they somehow can conjure up from the devil special type of powers that can destroy the United States. And therefore, it's not a rational situation. You have to then be tough with this power. They're even talking about assassinating him, because that way you get, of course, rid of the devil. So you're entering actually a sort of discourse, but it's very revealing discourse, because it's actually, I think it's a dangerous road that obviously they're taking.
I'm going to take 3 questions now, just to group them, because we need to get through quite a few. So it's going to be here first, Said, and then Sarah. You did say you wanted to ask a question. So you're one of 3?
Thank you. So, in your
keep them concise.
In your 1953 book about the 1953 coup, the root causes of the Anglo-American Revolution, you mentioned some causes. For example, you mentioned that following the coup, with the dismantling of the National Front and the weakening of the Tudor Party and the Labour movement and weakening of the secular elements, there was a power vacuum. And this vacuum was filled by religious elements. Will it be true then to say that the basis of the 1979 revolution was one of that there was this festering religious resentment and a struggle, line of a struggle that led to it?
Let me just take a couple of other questions, and we collect them, if that's all right. Keep it short.
Thank you very much for your talk, Professor Abrahamian. I have 2 questions, both of them related. Okay, both of them related to the concept of the cause of the revolution and legitimacy. One of them is related to the rise of new citizenship in Iran, which began sometimes around the early 1900s. But what happened was that it became very, very quick during the 1960s. Basically because of the rapid changes in the country after what we call the White Revolution. The rise of the new citizenship in terms of education and the connection between different parts of the country, and also the creation of the new clergy, in fact, the modernization of the whole idea of being a clerical Shia person, okay? And then the other one, again, is related to this new cleric that was actually modernized by Reza Shah, ironically. And what happened was that we have the rise of Shia Islam as a political force becoming more and more important during the course of the 20th century. And from what I remember, the discourse of the 1970s was not concerned with Mossadegh. Okay, obviously you are right, because you were talking about the wrong origin of the Shah's power. But when we talk about the causes of the revolution, I think this modernization of the clergy and the rise of the new clergy, and also the rise of new citizenship, the new idea that we can change the government, became very, very dominant among the newly educated people. Remember that during the 1960s, many people who did not have the possibility of going abroad and study went because the king made it possible for them to go abroad and study. And most of them became the enemy of the king because they quickly were absorbed, in a way, became interested in the ideas that were against the regime because they wanted to change the system. So two basic things, the rise of new citizenship and the rise of the new clergy as the main causes of the revolution, rather as two other main causes of the revolution, rather than just the 1953 Coup.
Why don't you take those two questions, and then I'll get the other two afterwards.
So actually, I mean, I'll answer your question first because it's so fresh. I mean, what you're asking is basically cultural changes, institutional changes as a prerequisite. I would agree with that, with the caveat that let's say both of them could be exaggerated. In terms of institution, it's true that by 79, the clerics were more of an institution than before. But even so, it's not really an institution. If you're talking about an institution, a hierarchy of command and so on, in 79, Khomeini is just one of the Mujtahids, and the others don't actually agree with him. So it's not an institution as such. And his influence is much more charismatic rather than institutionalized. So I think Bavarians who use, like Abrahamian, who use it as an institution conflict, I think exaggerate the establishment of such an issue. The clerics become an institution after the revolution. The revolution produces them as an institution, not the clerics actually producing the revolution. So, I mean, even at the revolutionary height, you find many clerics did not participate. They either opposed or were neutral. And it was after really the success that they joined the system. Here there's actually a wonderful oral history of a guy who was organizing daily demonstrations in Tehran, southern Tehran, and he calls them bachehar, the kids, neighborhood kids, mostly high school students. They were every day demonstrating, throwing stones at the army and stuff. They tried to organize in the mosque. The mosque cleric threw them out. He didn't want anything to do with them. He was against that. And throughout the revolution, he refused to participate. And then the day Khomeini returned, he saw this same cleric in a jeep with a Kalashnikov. So he'd become overnight a supporter of the revolution. But at the height of the revolution, it was really kids in the street doing it, not the clerics. So I think the role of the clerics is exaggerated. In terms of new citizenship, I mean, I think there's a false notion that in pre-modern societies, somehow people were willing to accept everything. People often in medieval Europe, medieval Middle East, often revolted, rioted, and so on, threw stones at authority. There was this type of anti-authoritarian stream always there. You don't need to read Voltaire or Rousseau to accept those things. So I think the idea of new citizenship I'm not sure how far that has become ingrained, actually, because for the word modernity, modernization is often merely used out like revolution. At the core of it is, I think, the Enlightenment notion that one has inalienable rights from nature, that one is born with certain basic rights. And I'm not sure how much that concept is even nowadays accepted. The people who actually opposed reforms, one of their main bêtes noires was this notion of individual inalienable rights. That was their reason for opposing the Enlightenment. So someone like Shariati, who may sound very modern, he was dead against the idea that we were born with certain inalienable rights. If we have rights, it comes from God, okay? That makes it a completely different discourse, very dangerous discourse, because once you say rights could come from God, then who interprets God's laws? Is it some sociologist at the Sorbonne, or is it someone who spent 20 years in Rome studying the Hadiths, okay? So I think the concept of discourse is very important. It's a dangerous route to follow because it's not a supermarket. You go in, you pick out what you want. It has its parameters, its logic, its basis. And once you enter that discourse, you're basically trapped into that discourse. So the saying, well, new citizenship sounds good, but what's lying underneath that premise? Oh, okay, the vacuum. Yes, I think institutionally it created after 53 because of dismantling. All basically civil society was disbanded except for, of course, the mosques. So that created, sort of, you could say, a vacuum that could be filled in. But again, I think that's exaggerated only because the revolution wasn't really a mosque revolution. It was much more than that.
Thank you for your talk. I was wondering if you would say that Ayatollah Khomeini had charismatic. Sorry. Is it?
It is on.
Oh?
It is on. It is
Okay.
on.
I was wondering if you would say that Ayatollah Khomeini had charismatic legitimacy, but also traditional legitimacy because of religion. That's it.
Whether Ayatollah Khomeini had charismatic and traditional legitimacy, a Weberian question, I suspect. Khomeini.
Yeah. I think, clearly it's much of his authority. People obeyed him not because he was a traditional Ayatollah, but because of charisma, even non-religious people. This is laughable, and some people find it embarrassing, but the idea that during the Hot Revolution you looked up in the moon and his face was there is actually, I think, a very potent image. And interesting enough, his advisors in Paris said, no, they're trying to discredit us because they're trying to make us medieval, somehow superstitious. But there were people in Iran writing about that. Yes, they saw the Khomeini's image there. I think that's part of, the sort of the charisma, but you have to explain why that charisma appeared in at this time. And I think Khomeini also, as politically shrewd enough, one of the, very shrewd politicians of the 20th century, is that that charisma had to be institutionalized if it was going to survive. So the elaborate constitution that was designed, partly I guess it's knowledge of what happened to the Prophet and after his death. He wanted to make sure that it was all established, all the routine systems, that someone else could take over once he's gone. So it is a routinization of the ritual. In fact, I think Weber would have loved it. From a distance, obviously, but it fitted in very much with the idea of how charisma can be routinized. So you do get a situation, I mean, it is a crisis situation. The guy who is groomed to take over suddenly becomes a loose cannon. So they bring out someone very uncharismatic, a sort of grey blur, and place him in the system, and it survives. I mean, people say, well, he can't last long. Well, it's 30 years or so he's lasted. And I suspect he will, once he's gone, he will also have someone probably even worse replacing him.
I mean, on the issue of seeing Khomeini's face in the moon, I mean, one of the interesting things I discovered when I was doing some interviews with some of the disenfranchised aristocrats from the White Revolution was they were pushing this line actually with many of their tenants and others, and they knew it was a lie, but they were basically pushing the line that we can he's in the moon, he's being so that they tried to cultivate this charismatic image. And when I asked them, I said, why would you do that? They said, because we thought that what Khomeini was going to do was he would return us all our lands that we had been divested from in 1963, and that he was going to come and restore the old order, like as it was some glorious revolution of 1688 or something. It was really quite a bizarre, but there's a whole segment of what the sort of the old traditional aristocracy, basically their role in actually promoting some of what Khomeini represented, because they completely misread him, obviously. I mean, they understood him as, they saw in line of what you're saying that the Shah had basically done America's bidding in the land reform, and that Khomeini would come and restore the traditional order, and that was very simple. And that's why they promoted a lot of this imagery, and they wanted to, superstition was part of the political culture.
They should have spent more time reading Khomeini.
Yes, I know, absolutely. They got.
And it is a very good example for
Hang on, go on.
proving it was charismatic authority because of its irrationality.
Well, of course. Let me go to.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Make it as quick as possible. We've got a considerable number of politically engaged literary movements between two revolutions. So some literary historians consider them as products of the situation, and some argue that they are actually shaping the whole process. They lead some part of this, they play a role in this process of some literary historians. For instance, Shafi'i Katkani is one of those who think these are products of the time, and some other, like Reza Barahani, think they are actually shaping the concept of revolution in people's mind by changing the idea of modernization. Gives the idea of changing to people and makes them to do something, and they play their role in this way. So how do you explain the political act of literature in this, between two revolutions?
Of course, I think on a larger level, the intelligentsia, I would say, played an important role. But you have to put it in a larger context. Yes, especially in the early stages, the short-term causes like the Goethe poetry, the reading sessions, and generally, of course, the writings going back from the 1940s of talking about the idea of change, fundamental change. A lot of the best writers basically were engagé writers, you can say. But how far, I would say, they're crucial in the revolution is a different issue. I think their readership is predominantly among intelligentsia itself, college-educated, basically professional, salaried. How far that stretches beyond that to working class peasantry is debatable. I don't think they played, any more than in other revolutions, intellectuals played, they could say, the vanguard role. They played a role, but in terms of real cultural change, I wouldn't put too much to it. I mean, their writings are important, but predominantly important to us intellectuals. But I think on a nationwide level, I don't think they can explain the revolution. And how far their ideas spread beyond that is something debatable. In the French Revolution, you can say, you know, that the works of the French Enlightenment was spread around a lot through other popular sources, especially through theater, cartoons, and so on. In Iran, I think there was still a wide gap between the literate and the general public.
Thank you very much, Professor. I wanted to come back to what you said about the middle class feeling that considerable benefits where you wrote it after the revolution. I wonder if you could comment on how Khomeini, Ali Ahmad, and other obviously opposition writers, how they specifically tailored discourse to appeal to the urban middle class, you know, those especially who had consumerist luxury sort of, you know, at very much easily at their fingertips, really.
I'm just going to take one final question and then we're going to wrap this up, I think. So the final question goes to Leo. Excellent.
Hi, thank you very much for a very interesting talk. My question is more of a modern one, but kind of deriving from a historical sense. I was thinking, given that history sometimes tends to kind of repeat itself, given that with you know, with the situation that is Iran is in internationally with sanctions and what have you, do you think that there would be some form of a kind of neo-Mossadegh in, if not the near future, in the future in general? Because, you know, for the greater good of Iranian people and the country.
That's a very good question to end on, thank you. He was saying that, if I've got this right actually, but I mean, he was saying that given that history, I mean, I have to say he said possibly repeats itself, which I don't think it does, not quite in the same way, but let's say first time is tragedy, second time is farce, but hopefully not. Would it, given the current crisis the country is facing, is there a possibility of a new Mossadegh, sort of a new liberal leader in a sense, liberal Democrat, shall we say? We have plenty of liberal Democrats here, we can ship them over.
Actually, both questions I think go to a class system. I think Iran is very much class stratified. So despite all the populist talk of the revolution and Khomeini's, without populism it wouldn't have succeeded. But once you, I think, tear away the populism, there's much more class politics involved. And whether it's basically within the Islamic context or not, what it boils down to is whose interests basically politics are serving. And you find that despite all the rhetoric, the revolution was overall very much middle class oriented. So, for instance, when old aristocrats were sort of deluded themselves, there was some source for that, because actually in Khomeini's writing there's always stress on property rights. with the qualification, as long as the property is obtained legitimately, either Islamically, that is legitimate. You can't expropriate property from someone who has it. So in a way, it fits into the bourgeois notion of a divine right of property. Just to give you a vignette, I bumped into a very successful businessman in California who'd been very successful in Iran, very successful now. He told me that Khomeini occupied his house up in Shimran area, and as soon as he occupied it, they would put the rent for the house in his bank account. So he was always paying money for rent. And I said, why? Well, he said, well, if he didn't pay rent, his prayers wouldn't count. He would be, violating someone else's property. So he was putting money there to make it valid. Of course, he couldn't go back. If he went back, he would be automatically shot as a Taghuti. But the legal concepts are here very much stressing the importance of the sacredness of property. In the debates you had about land reform, I mean, the whole land reform bogged down because eventually Khomeini and the other clerics decided that you could not take away, you couldn't put a limit on agricultural property. If someone had a lot of property, got legitimately there, had it, you couldn't take it away just on the grounds that it's right to redistribute property. So it does, overall, if you fit into the discourse and you're considered Islamic, the laws protect you. And then that means it really protects the propertied class. And I think you're right, actually, in your last book, describing it as basically a bazaar revolution. But then that creates another problem. If it's basically a revolution that supports the bazaar middle class, what happens then to lower classes? What do they benefit? And that's where Ahmadinejad came in. And he used the argument that, well, these people, Rafsanjani people got rich, we need to distribute wealth to the poor. And to some extent, actually, it seems that statistically there was more equality under his year. And now it's going to go back, and there's a widening distribution of income. And then, of course, the budget becomes important. Who is getting basically the oil resources and so on. So it does basically, just because it's Islamic doesn't mean that class politics don't disappear. In terms of a new Mossadegh, yes, actually in some ways what you find after the revolution, after basically the atrocities after 85, 86, and then the reform movement was under Khatami, there's much more appreciation of the talk that had existed before the 1960s, which is in a way a reverse to the discourse of the constitutional revolution, liberalism, and so on. So I was struck by the new intellectuals suddenly discovering the virtues of the Enlightenment under Khatami. And they were writing as if this was new. It's like they'd never read Iranian history. What was De Khoda talking about in 1906? They don't know anything about the Iranian history. And suddenly they've discovered, it's a good idea to have a jury system or a legal system that's separate from politics and to talk about individual rights. So that becomes, again, important. But, of course, it's much more, I would say, a middle-class phenomena nowadays.
So do you think there will be another Mossadegh coming? Hopefully. You don't want to comment on Leo's suggestion that history might repeat itself. I don't know whether history would repeat itself. Would history repeat itself, Leo? Maybe we'll leave that hanging. Maybe we'll leave that hanging, Leo. It was a suitable question to finish the evening with. Let me just... well, I think that's... I mean, it's a fascinating way to end in some ways, because you have also drawn a lovely thread back to the constitutional revolution as well, and the ideas of, the Enlightenment, as you say, that many of the people in the post-revolutionary period suddenly rediscovered a whole sort of mode of political thinking and ideas that had been generated earlier, but of course had been discarded as being inauthentic or not sufficiently rooted in the local culture. So, I mean, in a sense, they, as you quite rightly say, they sort of like rediscovered their history in a sense, or rediscovered a sort of a historical phenomenon. I just want to say one bit of housekeeping before I formally thank Professor Abrahamian for his tour de force this evening. In particular, the fact that, I mean, if you look at the time now, he's been talking, I think, for a better part of 2 hours on and off, at least an hour, and then another hour while you've been answering the questions, which I hope you'll agree have been very stimulating, haven't they, Sarah? So it's really been a pleasure to have you here and to witness this. What I wanted to say, for those of you who have the stamina and you can manage this, on Friday we'll be having a continuation, obviously, of our look at the historical aspects of the Islamic Revolution. I understand that the final program is now up, so you can go and have a look at it if you wish. And hopefully, if you have the time, do please come and attend on Friday for the workshop, which I hope will be of interest to you all. Now, as I introduced Professor Abrahamian when we were going into the talk, I said he really is one of the giants of historical writing, and one of the giants of in the writing of modern Iranian history. And I think we witnessed that this evening, that your mastery of the sources in particular have been something to behold. And I would suggest to you, if there's one person I have to say who, in my own writing on modern Iranian history, who whenever he brings out an article or a book, I always tell you it's essential reading, and you have to read it, because he always comes out with some wonderful insights and some wonderful ideas, as I said, principally because of this marriage, in many ways, of Western historical ideas, methodology, critiques, and bringing it into that Iranian sphere and really making sure that modern Iranian history is mainstream. I mean, this is what we want to do. Modern Iranian history should be part of the panoply of our reading of the history of civilizations. I know it's a dangerous word these days, but the history of civilizations, countries, nations, whatever you want to call it, that rank among the best and most well-studied of European histories or North American histories. And we would certainly like to see here in the Institute of Iranian Studies this development of the field of Iranian history so that it can take its rightful place, I think, among the broader historical studies. So it just remains for me to thank you for coming and being such an attentive audience and asking such pertinent and delightful questions. Some really quite tricky ones as well, I have to say. Very good of you. And above all, to thank Professor Abrahamian for his tour de force this evening and providing us with this wonderful lecture and being so patient and attentive to all our questions. Thank you once again.